Okay, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. So, Making of a Murderer. This was a big show on Netflix about the Stephen Avery and Brendan Daisey case. There are two reporters that know this case better than anyone. One of them is one of our big time guys here at the Law and Crime Network. You don't get any better than this guy. He's actually sitting right next to me. Aaron Keller. Aaron, how are you?
Bob, good to see you.
Great to see you. And Colleen Henry from out there in Wisconsin, you were a reporter covering, as I understand it, because I listened to a clip here, you and Aaron were kind of like adversaries while this big trial was going on, each one trying to get the scoop to outscoop the other one, yet you're both here now. Welcome.
Thank you. And neither of us bled, I might add.
Well, that's good. It's all good spirited competition and fun. But nevertheless, this case has really garnered a lot of attention. And Making of a Murderer 2 is coming out. And there's a lot of controversy going on about this case. 500,000 signatures, people believing that these were false convictions. It's got a torturous history in terms of the legal proceedings involved in the case. There's conflicts of interest that are being alleged with respect to the investigators, planting of evidence with regard to this brutal, horrible murder. So, Aaron, let me just toss to you first. You are in studio. Can you give us a little backdrop of what this second series is supposed to be showing us and give us a little idea, the viewers, what this case is all about and its twisted history?
I'm going to object to the two-part question here, but I'll answer it anyway. So I'll answer it nonetheless. Look, okay, so this all goes back. Stephen Avery, 1985, he's convicted of rape. 18 years later, he's exonerated because a DNA test that was done on evidence from that 1985 rape indicates that he wasn't the rapist. It was another known rapist in the area whose DNA was on the victim. Okay, once the testing became available, they did it. They drugged their heels a little bit, some critics say, but the bottom line is the test exonerates Stephen Avery. He's out of prison. I met him about a year after he was released when I moved to Wisconsin to take a job there. And then about a year after that, he gets accused of this rape and murder of Teresa Halbach. So questions as to, did he do it? Why would he do it after spending 18 years in prison? Why would he get out to do this? And did it actually happen the way the state theorized that it happened? Those are the big questions. The series basically picks up where the first season of the series left off. So a lot of things have happened in the interim there. He has a new defense attorney, Brendan Daisey, his nephew, who was also accused and convicted. His case went up through the federal appellate courts, almost to the highest court in the land, but not quite.
Hey, Colleen, as I understand this case, after he served the 18 years and was exonerated by the DNA evidence, he filed a civil suit against the authorities. Can you give us a little idea, because this becomes part of what the defense now argues is the motivation for illegal conduct by law enforcement, and can you give us also an idea of what kind of area or neighborhood are we dealing with? How much of a population, how much do people know one another there, and how many police officers actually investigate cases there?
Well, if you watch the series, Manitowoc is not New York. It's not Chicago. It's not Los Angeles. It is a very tiny little place that falls in the middle of the Milwaukee and Green Bay TV markets. It's so small it doesn't even really have its own TV station. So it's a sweet little town on Lake Michigan. It's rural when you just get out of town. There's really nothing there but agriculture, and there's used to be a good deal of boat making business and some industry, but it is small town America at its very, very, very core. And the Averys are a very interesting family that has a long history of running a junkyard. And you understand sort of the emotional connotation that goes with being a junkyard dog. And some people would argue that's what Steve Avery was. And so he ends up being exonerated. And this was a major, major story, as you can imagine, in Wisconsin, that this guy had served 18 years. And as we later learned, there were indications all along the way that perhaps the prosecution and the police have the wrong guy. And the police failed to act. They got information that said, hey, by the way, that guy you're holding is probably not the guy. I got another guy who says he did it. And yet nothing really was done. So ultimately, once he was released, they filed a $36 million lawsuit, and that was pending, and kind of newly pending about the time Teresa Halbach went missing. So I'm sure Aaron had the same reaction I did. And when the newsroom, when all of a sudden we get this alert that the last place that Teresa Halbach was seen, because of course she's a missing person, and that's kind of a big deal in rural Wisconsin, was on the Avery junkyard,
Right. Well,
salvage yard.
Colleen, I want to pick up on a point that you used about the junkyard dog, because there is anecdotal statements in this case that at one point in time, Mr. Avery had doused a cat in gasoline and lit it on fire, a fiance who indicates that he was abusive, a prisoner that came in and testified or spoke to the state to say that he wanted to create a torture chamber. I don't know if any of these things are accurate or not accurate, but we do have something that this new series apparently will present, and this is a phone call that was captured between Avery and his sister. And so let's listen to this junkyard dog and see what that call was like.
Well, I don't think it's kind of him. It's the other one.
Who's the other one?
Your husband.
He didn't do it either, Christ, Stephen. I was fucking with him.
Well, you weren't with him all day.
I was with him from 5 o'clock on.
Yeah.
And, yeah, plus he was in the hospital with his mother for most of the day.
Well,
nothing.
I don't know about that either.
So you're actually thinking Scott did this?
Don't ask me. I don't know who did it. I know I didn't.
Well, neither did he.
Well,
And neither did Bobby. So she better get it right out of her fucking mind, because I called that bitch today.
Oh, my. Aaron, can you just put this conversation between the defendant, Avery, and his sister into context of what's being said there?
Oh, there's a lot going on there, okay? And this is years and years and years worth of history. But the bottom line there, Stephen Avery, he's calling his sister from jail, okay, within the last year or so. And bottom line, now Stephen Avery's new attorney is starting to point the finger at his sister's son as a possible killer. Okay, she's trying to deflect attention away from Stephen Avery and say, well, the nephew might have done it. And not the nephew who was convicted, but another nephew. So that's the tension that's blowing up now within this family. And look, a lot of people who watched this series saw the Averys the first time around as this very cohesive family. They're all in it together. That phone call crystallizes what I remember about family members trying to throw one another under the bus in the early days of this investigation. You know, now when you watch the series, they're all supporting Stephen. They all think that he's innocent. Well, back then, I heard the opposite out of some members of the family. So that one phone call said to me, that's the Avery family that I remembered. That's the Avery family that I saw publicly. I saw all this infighting, people telling me one thing, other people telling me the opposite. That's what I remember when I was a reporter up there covering the case 10 years ago.
All right, well, Colleen Henry, while you were out there competing with Aaron for data and information to bring to your media outlet, do you have a similar sensibility based on what you were covering and you were reporting about this family?
Aaron, I'm sure had the same experience we did, which was very often when you would approach members of the family, some of them were very willing to talk to you. Some of them were very willing to talk to you off camera. And some of them would talk to you exactly the way Barbara Toddick did in that phone call. And you couldn't put it on TV because it violated FCC rules. It is a colorful family. They are very outspoken, very opinionated. When you, for example, would go to the salvage yard to look for somebody to interview, that would very often be the reaction you would get. Very profane and understandably frustrated. But, you know, it was from day to day hard to tell who was siding with whom. And keep in mind, this is important here, that you don't really see this in Making a Murderer. This is a family that, you know, all of the brothers had histories of sex crimes, you know, sex allegations. This is all in the public record. I'm not talking, this isn't defamatory. This is stuff that we reported on, we pulled out of court records. So, you know, Steve and his brother Chuck and his brother Earl all had allegations and in some cases convictions, criminal charges, and then convictions for improper sexual conduct, sexual assault, that kind of a thing. So this wasn't what you would call, you know, the cleavers, for example, when you would roll on up. And in some measures, sometimes you wonder, you don't see some of that distress within the family portrayed in...
Yeah, I'd call that actually dysfunction. But nevertheless, Colleen, Aaron, There are a lot of things here about that lawsuit being filed, that the officers investigating and the prosecutor's office, maybe some conflicts of interest, but also with regard to the coroner and the sheriff, there's some real wobbliness with this. We have a clip we're going to show you, and I want to talk to you on the other end about what are some of the allegations the defendant is making about the appearances of impropriety, if not actual improprieties, with regard to how law enforcement went about investigating this case. We'll be back on the other end.
The next day in the morning, I was going to go out to the scene, and I was called to a meeting by Sheriff Peterson. I thought, oh, good, I'm finally getting a meeting. I'm finally going to get a update on what's going on and when I will be able to come out to the scene. But when I got there, at that time, I was told I will not be going out to the case. I will not be going out to the scene, and if I do, I will be arrested.
Aaron, you were out there. Tell us what's going on here between the chain of command with the coroner and the sheriff, and why was the coroner not permitted to go to that scene? What enforcement powers do they have?
Well, look, I mean, the coroner is above the sheriff under Wisconsin law, and the second season of this series really does a great job of pointing this out. Why was she kept off the scene? Bottom line, a lot of people who really point to the sheriff's department as doing an improper investigation, in this case, point to this as really Exhibit A towards what was going on here. She's supposed to be called in when any human remains are found, and she is the primary law enforcement officer who's supposed to be a check and balance on the constitutional power of the sheriff's department. So why would the sheriff's department not want her there? This is one of these things. Is it because, as Avery has alleged all along, that evidence was planted? Is it because they didn't want her to see anything funny going on? We don't have an exact answer, but it's Exhibit A for people who think that funny business was going on during that search.
And Colleen, to that point, I want to get to the fact we got the civil suit pending, we've got the sheriff's office, and I believe some of the actual officers who were part of the civil suit that Avery was filing that are investigating this case. A coroner not permitted to be where she's lawfully allowed to be. There's copious amounts of evidence that point to Avery, but the allegation is it was planted, it was an improper investigation. What are your thoughts about the oddness of the conflicts of interest?
Well, you know, here's my observation. I don't know whether the police planted evidence. That was obviously the defense during the first trial. But I do know that, as was perfectly proper, the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, because it had a $36 million lawsuit pending against it, told us and the world that it was not going to do this investigation, that it had called in Calumet County because of the conflict of interest. It had asked Calumet County's sheriff to investigate, and it had asked its prosecutor, the district attorney, Ken Kratz, to investigate. And the whole idea was it was going to isolate itself from any possible questions about the fairness of this investigation. So say what you will about whether or not evidence was planted. I can't answer that question at this point. What I can tell you is Manitowoc County set itself up for this.
I agree with that 100%, Colleen. Look, you were there in that room when we heard the promise that they would erase any conflict of interest. We heard that promise. You heard it. I heard it. The whole world heard it. And then we find out Manitowoc officers were on the scene and found some of the most critical evidence.
Yeah. So
what I found was that, of course, this coroner didn't get in, but the sheriff's deputies did. And wasn't it interesting that they were the ones who happened to have found some of the most critical evidence in the initial trial?
All right, Colleen, thank you so much. Listen, I was the head of an agency, and I can tell you without any doubt whatsoever, if I were in the same spot, I would be calling to have it conflicted out to another place to avoid the very thing that's happening here. It doesn't do anybody any favors, especially when they make a promise to do it and they don't keep it. Makes you wonder. Okay, guys, we got to go to a break. Thank you so much, Colleen. Aaron will be back with more of Making a Murderer Part 2 and the two great reporters that actually covered the trial. Okay, Making a Murderer Season 2. I got Aaron and Colleen with us, and we were talking about this case. They reported from it directly when it was going on. They have more knowledge about it than probably anyone else in the media world. But Kathleen Zellner is the new attorney for Mr. Avery. And let's take a look at a clip where she's arguing about the manipulation and management of evidence that was improperly, in her opinion, taken by the police or actually planted by the police.
So we've got DNA on the bullet that's much more consistent with chapstick DNA than blood or the inside of the scalp. I believe that what happened is that chapstick was removed with a swab because we can see cotton fibers on the bullet, and the chapstick was put on the bullet.
Okay, Aaron, put this into context for us. What is she saying was done? Where was this evidence found?
Okay, so this was evidence that was found in Stephen Avery's garage. It's the bullet that the authorities, the prosecutor, said all along was the likely fatal bullet. They called it the bullet that killed Teresa Halbach. They thought it was the bullet that was fired through her head. Look, Kathleen Zellner is talking to a landlord that owns the property who says, well, I used to shoot my gun into that garage all the time. It's something that rural people do. And so she's saying that the bullet that the state said was the fatal bullet really has shards of wood on it because it was fired through the garage, that it doesn't have any shards of bone embedded in the lead, and therefore it couldn't have gone through the head of the victim in this case. And she's also saying, well, okay, the victim's DNA on it was planted. It was taken off of the victim's chapstick, okay, which was seized at her house for a DNA sample. And somehow she's saying that that chapstick wasn't brought straight to an evidence locker. It was brought over to the salvage yard. Why was it brought over to the salvage yard and not taken straight into an evidence locker? And what happened to it while it was there? And she says that this microscopic analysis of this so-called fatal bullet indicates no blood, a waxy substance, and then cotton fibers. So she's saying that that bullet was swabbed, or the chapstick, I should say, was swabbed, and it was put on the bullet, and that's how the victim's DNA wound up on the bullet.
Okay, so Colleen, we have a situation here which law enforcement's coming under the gun for the conflict reason that we talked about before. I just ticked off a couple of things here about this case that I found very powerful as evidence for the state. Some of that is that her phone, her camera, her PDA were found 20 feet from Avery's door, burned in a barrel. In prison, he tells an inmate he wanted to make a torture chamber so he can rape and torture people. That's a little bit more subjective. Her bones were found in a fire pit intertwined with steel belts from tires. There was the confession of Dassey, which I guess we're going to get into shortly, that confirms that that's where that stuff was found. Her Daisy Fuentes rivet was found inside of a barrel. I'm just ticking through something here. The phone records show that there were 2 star 67 anonymous calls made to her phone by Avery, and then after allegedly the murder, he made a direct call, which was to kind of try to establish an alibi, at least as argued by the state. We have the bullet and the ballistics that Aaron just talked about, and we have DNA, not blood, on the inside hood latch of the vehicle, as well as blood DNA. So in order for this theory of Ms. Zellner to work, all of that had to be planted by the police. And of course, she uses the lawsuit and the coroner being excluded from the crime scene, as well as the fact that they said they'd do an independent investigation and didn't. What are your thoughts?
I think it's head spinning. I don't know how you feel about it, Aaron. You know, this was all evidence presented at trial, and it went on over, 4 to 6 weeks. And there was an aggregate effect that I understood at the time of the verdict that the jury, I wasn't surprised the jury convicted. On the other hand, I really did think it could have gone either way at a certain point. We can get into that later, but, there was some FBI testimony at the very end that I think clinched it for the prosecution, in which the FBI said there's no way that the blood was planted, because if it had been planted and taken from a tube that he had taken in a blood sample, I would have had a preservative in it.
Right, and just real quick on that one point, Aaron, maybe you want to talk. But that expert, the FBI expert, came in, I believe, during the course of the trial. The defense never got an opportunity to get their own expert. Am I right on that fact?
Yes, you're right on that.
Yeah.
And he came in at the tail end of the trial. And as I said, up till that point, I don't know how you felt about it, Aaron, but I really kind of thought it could go either way, because it was so troubling, these places and times that Manitowoc just popped up. The Manitowoc Sheriff's Department always seemed to be the one offering up this critical piece of evidence, even though they said they should have had nothing to do with its collection.
That bothered me at the time, Colleen. But look, I think that Ken Kratz sealed it for the prosecution when on closing argument he got up there and said, are you, the local jurors, going to say that your local department is full of crooks? And, I mean, to analogize it, as I had several times, You know, that's like asking people in Wisconsin to say the Packers play lousy football. I don't know if that local jury was going to do that. But there were issues all the way through this case, Colleen, from my perspective. Ultimately, the jury convicted. There are issues about types of evidence that were allowed in under then current Wisconsin law. It really requires a probing look at the actual statutes on the book at the time.
Well, you got to be basically calling the police outright criminals to plant all this copious amounts of evidence. That would be a conspiracy that everyone would have to know about. Hard to kind of believe, but you never know. Hey, the media played a big role in this case. We want to show you something about how the media kind of affected the family in this case and come back on the other end and talk to two of the people that were kind of involved in that.
Their business. The media, TV, radio.
Avery's Auto Salvage has been the focus.
That's all you saw, Avery's Auto Salvage. Avery's Auto Salvage. And there's a lot of people that won't come out here. All kind of that. When there was no reason for it. Nothing happened here. Nothing.
Okay, that's Avery's father that's testifying about how the media affected his business and his family. Listen, it was a big case. Media has a right to be there. We have a short period of time. Colleen, I'll go to you first. Did the media play it fair with this case?
Tried. I really do. I think it became difficult at times for us to get access to the Hallbach family. And so I think sometimes when that happens, the defense side of the stories prevails in terms of the amount of time that's invested in telling the story. But I feel like we worked very hard and also we're respectful of the fact the Hallbachs didn't.
We got to go to a hard break, but Aaron, thoughts?
Yeah, Colleen, look, I agree. Look, nobody who watches this film knows how caustic it was to cover this case in real time, because no matter what you said, you were going to make someone else very, very upset.
Okay, listen, Aaron, Colleen, thank you so much. You guys did an excellent job. It's great to have talent like you as we go into the second season of Making a Murderer. We're going to go to a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Well, our producers are awesome enough to give us some more time, and we have a very special additional guest. You can't make it up here because Law and Crime gets the very best. We have our two great reporters that have given us a lot of insight. But Jerry Buting, you were Avery's lawyer, and I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to interview you because you were the trial attorney. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Jerry, listen, I don't know if you got to hear as you were getting all mic'd up about everything going on here, but just tell me in short order, did Avery get a fair trial in your mind, or is it possible the police planted this copious amount of evidence and this was this huge conspiracy directed at your client?
No, as I've said repeatedly, I've never felt like Stephen Avery got a fair trial. And, from my perspective, the good thing about Making a Murderer, both Part 1 and Part 2, I think, is it's allowed a lot more people around the world to see what I've seen all along, which is that he did not get a fair trial.
Well, you wrote a book, it was just up on the screen, Illusions of Justice, based upon this very case. Let me ask you specifically, I mean, I read the articles, I wasn't there to watch it. There's a lot of evidence in the case. The only way that I could think that that evidence would be overcome would be if the police planted that evidence. Is that your suggestion?
Well, that's where we thought the evidence led, and that's why we raised the issues that we did. It's not something that you want to do lightly. It's not a favored defense by any stretch of the imagination. So, we just went where we thought the evidence took us, and, it didn't take us very far. It was very difficult to try and prove a police frame-up in court because, who better than police would know how to plant evidence?
But, Jerry, as far as I see, this argument that you've got, or that one has, that he files this lawsuit against the very department and officers that are then subsequently investigating the case, the fact the coroner is not allowed out there, which is in violation of law, all of these conflicts of interest, the prosecutor's statement it was going to be an independent investigation that turned out not to be from a different agency. Were you allowed to bring all that information out to the jury, or did the judge stop you from that?
The judge stopped us from significant parts of it. The coroner, for instance, was never allowed to testify. We thought that was very suspicious. It's like suddenly they finally found somebody with some connection to Manitowoc County who somehow had a conflict of interest, when they've got their officers crawling all over the Avery salvage yard for a week. Deborah Cockett, the coroner, is like the only one who had no conflict. She had no connection to his lawsuit. And yet they used that argument to bar her from exercising her statutory duties to investigate whenever the remains are found within her jurisdiction.
Yeah, I just have to ask real quick before I go back to Aaron and Colleen. On what basis does a judge prevent a defense attorney from bringing out information that there was a motive, means, and opportunity for these officers who have a direct conflict of interest and who would not allow the coroner their statutory right to be able to be at that scene, an independent person, and that's the whole reason the coroner's put into place? What basis did the judge deny that?
My recollection was it was, well, I don't see the relevance in this, or it would only confuse the jury. I mean,
Wow.
Those were sort of the catchwords that, in my mind, meant, uh-oh, this is something the defense can score some points on, so maybe we better not allow it. That was certainly the impression that the state gave in trying to prevent it. We were allowed to challenge the officers that were searching the place about how, particularly Link and Colburn, how they'd been, directly involved in his lawsuit and yet volunteered to search Stephen Avery's residence. But when it came to one of the most suspicious things in the investigation was the failure to document where and how those bones were found. None of the sites where bones were found in the burn pit or the burn barrel or the quarry sites were ever photographed. I mean, they took photographs of empty boxes in this case, and yet somehow they don't manage to get a single photograph of where these bones were found and what they looked like in situ. If the coroner had been brought in, that would never have happened.
Right,
And
right.
so I think it was a very important piece of evidence, and the jury should have been entitled to hear that because it went, once again, to their bias and their efforts to shape this investigation in a way that would focus only on Stephen Avery.
Yeah, and it's really unusual that in a defense case, especially of this magnitude, that they usually let the defense pretty much get out whatever they want when it goes to credibility. Aaron, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, look, I mean, Jerry, from 10 plus years ago when we were throwing questions back and forth between one another, this stuff bothered everybody back then. Why is it that some of this evidence didn't come out? And I know Wisconsin has some, or at least at the time, had some pretty loosey-goosey evidence rules, at least with the EDTA and everything. But, Jerry, I got to ask you, what do you make of this chapstick on the alleged fatal bullet? That, to me, is one of the new things that Kathleen Zellner is bringing out that might be the big bombshell piece of evidence that might blow the state's case up.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to wait till we get to court when she actually has a hearing and can expound on that a little bit more than what you see in the documentary. But it could be a very significant piece of evidence. I thought, frankly, the trace analyst with the electron microscope analysis of the bullet was some of the more interesting, I think, newly discovered evidence that she came up with. And it, we thought that the explanation for the DNA on that single bullet could have been contamination in the crime lab, or that it was planted because Link was there 4 months after the investigation had supposedly ended. And he's there again. But we didn't have the kind of information or that she had that might actually prove more substantively that the bullet was in fact planted.
Jerry, let me ask you, do you think that based on what you're hearing, especially with regard to the second series here on Netflix, on Making of a Murderer, you wrote a book on it, you were a lawyer, you were intimately involved in the process. Do you think all these things that Ms. Zellner is bringing out was somehow going to cause a new hearing, at least with respect to this?
Oh, absolutely, it should cause a hearing. I was shocked, frankly, that the Sheboygan County judge denied a 200-page motion in a 6-page decision that ignored really 90% of the claims. The standards to get an evidentiary hearing for a post-conviction motion are not that high. You can't make, conclusory allegations, but In her instance, she had plenty of information. And the judge didn't even wait for the state to file a response before denying the motion in total.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Colleen, did you get the same sensibility that you felt that somehow the defense was being deprived of an opportunity to bring out relevant evidence by this judge?
Well, I think Jerry will talk to you a little bit about the Denny evidence, about the ability to point the finger at other people. And, you know, the judge denied their request to point fingers at the people that Zellner has now pointed fingers at in this new motion, and as you've seen in Making a Murderer Part 2. Interestingly, though, too, Jerry, as I recall, tell me if I'm wrong, but wasn't all of that sealed? I mean, you know, all these court records that pointed at the potential third-party suspects were sealed for a long time, wasn't it? I mean, they weren't going to let anybody hear who else might have done it, and certainly the jury was never allowed to hear it.
That's right. It was sealed for a long time, but I think once the trial or maybe even after the original appeal, but I think it was really after the trial was done, those documents were unsealed. And so they're a matter of public record now. The people that we named, and there's some that we didn't name because we weren't able to establish that they had actual access and opportunity to have been at the crime scene.
Jerry, we don't have a lot of time. We only have a minute left, but let me ask you just real quick in 30 seconds or less. On appeal, I'm sure the argument was raised that you were prevented from mounting a defense because the judge prohibited this evidence. Where did that go? What did the appellate court say about that?
The appellate court affirmed the trial court's decision. It basically ruled that you have to prove motive of a third party to commit the crime before you can introduce evidence that they were involved. And of course, that has the problem of if you're by accident of who the victim is, if you're charged with the homicide of a otherwise blameless victim who doesn't have a lot of enemies, what is the motive? What was Avery's motive?
Okay, guys. I'm sorry, in a word or less, yes or no, I'll ask each one of you, starting with Aaron. Is this case eventually going to get reversed and a new trial come out?
I can't answer it with a yes or no, Bob. I mean, look, the case has had problems from the prosecution standpoint.
What are your thoughts?
There are issues with the defense. Look, I'm here to listen to whatever new evidence Kathleen Zellner can come up with. I've already written about some of the tactics that I'm not sure that I agree with. Other pieces of evidence, look, I'm willing to keep an open mind.
Colleen, what about you? You want to go on the limb here?
On the limb I go out on is we don't know what we don't know. So I don't know what I don't know at this point. And honestly, I've seen things in Part 2 that I thought were very interesting, but of course they haven't been challenged. So I'd like to see the adversarial process at work.
How about you, Jerry? You're the closest to this case. You know the decisions inside and out. What would you bet? Are you going to get a retrial of this case or no?
Well, I'm hopeful. I certainly think that she is going to get an evidentiary hearing, and that's going to open up a whole lot of other avenues, including having Mr. Kratz on the witness stand being cross-examined for a lot of the tactics and the withholding of evidence that he was involved in, as well as Fassbender. So I think there's a lot yet to come. I would not be surprised if there's a Part 3 to Making a Murder.
Wow, okay. Listen, Colleen Henry and Jerry Buning, I'm sorry, and Buning, my bad, and Aaron Keller from the Law&Crime Network. I want to thank you so much for the time you've taken. It's a fascinating case, and all three of you professionals have done an amazing job. I'm sure there's going to be more to come. Please, guys, come back again. We're going to take a quick break, and on the other end, we'll come back with some more in crime.